I've got some videos for you to watch that'll introduce you in more detail to the writers we're going to talk about today in the Reformation. But I wanted to briefly make sure you look at the Ren and Reform page on the Student Aids tab for the Renaissance module and highlight a couple of things that you need to pay special attention to. First of all, with the Renaissance, which we actually talked about a couple days ago, be sure you remember the date 1420 AD when Brunelleschi designed the dome for the Florence Cathedral. That's often taken as the beginning of the Renaissance. As I said in an earlier one of these videos, nobody went to bed one night in the Middle Ages and woke up the next morning in the Renaissance. So there's no hard and fast beginning to the Renaissance, but this date's often used. In some of the Renaissance poetry, the similarities and differences between the idea of carpe diem, which reappears in the Renaissance era, and the idea of memento mori that was so dominant in the medieval era. They both start with the same beginning point, that is, life in this world is short, but they go from there in opposite directions. Carpe diem says life is short, so you better seize the day, have fun now while you can. Memento mori says life is short, so you need to live your life so that when you die you go to heaven rather than to hell. For the Reformation, which is really the focus for this session, note the date, 1517, Martin Luther posts 95 Theses for debate. Traditionally put these on the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany. That was a way of attracting a debate partner. And this event really sets in motion what becomes the Protestant Reformation. Okay, I think the video on Luther's one of the videos on Luther's going to mention these, but I want to make sure you get them down anyway. Key ideas in Luther's theology to look for in the reading. Sola fide, faith alone. There is nothing that human beings can do in order to earn salvation, to earn God's favor. It is by faith alone and sola gratia, grace alone. The only thing that makes salvation possible for anyone is purely the grace of God. We cannot earn it. We cannot do any works to merit our salvation. And sola scriptura, the only scripture alone, the only authority Luther accepts is that of the Bible itself. And the last one, and these are all Latin because Luther wrote in Latin, simul justus et peccator, at the same time justified and sinner. Luther really doesn't think that we're going to ever get beyond a constant struggle within ourselves to put sin to death, in his phrase. And so there is a tendency in Lutheran thought to resign oneself to the presence of evil in the world. That this is never going to go away, and there's really not much we can do to make things better. With John Calvin, one thing to note is the third use of the law. For Luther, the law is valuable in showing God's holiness and our sin, our need of Christ in Luther's view. But for Calvin, there is a third use. He thinks that the law does continue to guide us, to inform how we ought to live. Luther doesn't think so much. But Calvin does. And notice what he has to say about that. And so the Calvinist attitude tends to be less tolerant of evil, where Luther tends to, politicians are going to be politicians, they're all crooks, better a smart crook than a dumb one. A Calvinist perspective is more, no, throw the booger out. Traditionally, the acronym that's used to remember Calvin's teachings is the word TULIP. Each letter in TULIP standing for a key phrase in Calvin's theology. The T stands for total depravity. Now, this doesn't mean there is no good in human beings. But what it does mean is that there is no part of human nature that is untainted by sin. It's not that the soul is good and the body is evil, for example. No, sin permeates our whole essence. The U is universal sin. No one is exempt. And this feature of Calvinism is actually behind one of the unique structures in American government, and that is the idea of the balance of powers between the three branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial. The New England colonies were thoroughly Calvinist, Puritan. And so the result of this idea of universal sin is we don't trust anybody too much. And therefore, when the Constitution was being written, the setup was to limit any branch's power, because the idea was if any individual or any group of people has too much power, they will inevitably abuse it, because human beings are corrupt that way. And so we limit. So, for example, the Congress can pass laws, but the president can veto them. And even if the Congress overrides his veto, the Supreme Court can rule that legislation is unconstitutional and throw it out. And at the same time, then, the president nominates justices for the Supreme Court, but they have to be approved by the Senate, and so on. So each branch limits the power of the others, rooted in this Calvinist idea of universal sin. L is limited atonement. Not everyone can be saved. The atonement of Christ is only effective for those whom God has chosen, has elected. Look at the video that talks about how everything's rooted in the sovereignty of God. And for Calvin, this idea of election and predestination is actually a very comfortable one, because Calvin has an even more robust sense of human sin than Luther does. And so Calvin is even more convinced than Luther that if I have to do anything at all, I'll mess it up. The only way that anyone could ever be saved is if God does absolutely everything that is necessary. The I is irresistible grace. Those whom God has elected, has chosen for salvation, will get there, whether they want to or not. God's grace will inevitably get them. And the P stands for perseverance of the saints. Those whom God has truly chosen will not fall away. Not because of their inherent goodness, but because essentially God won't let them. And again, this offers for Calvin a comfort. I can't mess it up. If I could, I would. Not because I want to, but because that's the way I am. For Calvin, it's all in God's control. And look at the words he offers at the end of the reading I gave you from Calvin to try to offer this kind of comfort and assurance to those who are concerned about this idea of election. For Calvin, it is not a matter of our free will. It is all rooted in the sovereignty of God. Now, Menno Simmons, I learned to pronounce it Simmons. The video is going to pronounce it Simons. It's actually spelled several ways as well. The printing press was invented before spelling was standardized and before pronunciation was standardized. It is the father of what's called the left wing of the Reformation, the Anabaptist, the self-Baptist movement. The direct descendants of this are the what are still called the Anabaptists, the Mennonites, who took their name from Menno Simmons, the Amish, groups like that. But there is an influence on all of the churches that emphasize, as the reading I gave you from Simmons does, adult or believer's baptism, that one must be able to consciously choose and articulate a commitment to faith in order to be a candidate for baptism. Historically, most Christian denominations, not only Catholic, but many Protestant, including the Lutheran family of churches and the Presbyterian Reformed family of churches founded by John Calvin, as well as my Methodist tradition and the Anglican or Episcopal tradition from which it descends, all practice infant baptism. It's only with the Reformation that you get the rise of the idea that no, you have to be an adult. And the reason for that is because when an infant is baptized, the infant professes no faith. They can't say anything. Parents make the decision for them, as parents make all decisions for very small children. Churches that have infant baptism have a follow-up called confirmation, where the child, usually it's about the age of puberty, professes their own faith. Okay. The last thing in the reading is the Catholic response, the Council of Trent, that reaffirmed the idea that we talked about earlier in the semester of apostolic succession. Note the emphasis on the continuity of a line of bishops, because the faith is transmitted not only through the written scriptures, but also through the unwritten traditions of the apostles, and that those unwritten traditions have equal authority. Protestant Christianity sees itself as stripping away the accumulations, the buildup, like lime deposits on your faucet, to get back to the original purity. Catholic tradition says, no. You need the tradition to guide you. And related to that is the idea of the magisterium, the teaching office, the teaching authority of the church. Essentially, if I'm a Catholic theologian, if I think the Bible is saying something different from what the church teaches me that it's saying, then I need to recognize that I'm likely the one who's wrong, and I need to submit to the guidance of the church. Notice what the council says about that. It also lists the books that are considered to be part of the Bible. I didn't give you the list of the New Testament because there's no debate. Protestants and Catholics have the same New Testament. But the Catholic Old Testament is a little bit bigger. It includes books that are called deuterocanonical, second canonical, or apocrypha. Now the background to this is a Greek translation of the books of the Hebrew Bible, made in the centuries just before the time of Jesus. That's called the Septuagint. And those translations were made because Jews living in the diaspora, spread out outside of the land of Israel, many of them were no longer able to read Hebrew. And so, because Greek was the language that all educated people could read and write and speak, the books of the Hebrew Bible were translated into Greek. But this was done before the Jewish community finalized the canon, the list of books that made up their Bible. Things were fluid. And so the Septuagint, when Christianity arrived, the Septuagint became the Old Testament for the Christian church. And the Catholic Church maintains all of the books that were part of the Septuagint as their Old Testament. When the Jewish community did finalize their canon, somewhere around the end of the 1st century A.D., there's actually not a formal process for doing that, believe it or not only in Judaism but in Christianity. It's something that just kind of happens over time. The community gradually winnows out, weeds out which books it considers authoritative and which ones it doesn't. The Jews adopted a canon that contains the same books as the Protestant Old Testament. Though the Jewish canon arranges them differently, the Protestant Old Testament uses the list of books in the Jewish canon of the Bible, but follows the order in the Septuagint. Don't ask me why. I don't know. But that's why you get the differences. And so books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, for example, are part of the Catholic Old Testament, but not part of the Jewish Bible or the Protestant Old Testament. I gave you also from the Council of Trent the discussion of salvation, and notice how this is rooted in Thomas Aquinas, and behind him stands Aristotle and the four causes. But the idea that emerges there is called synergism, that we have to work together with God. The belief articulated by the council is, yes, salvation is by God's grace alone. We cannot earn it, we cannot merit it, but we do have to play some role, and that is to receive it. It's like if somebody gives you a Christmas present. If you never open it, do you really have it? We have to open it. We have to receive it. We have to accept that gift. We have to play some role in the process, minor as it might be. And then the final thing I gave you from the Council of Trent is the reaffirmation of the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, that in the Mass, when the priest says in Latin in the Middle Ages, "For this is my body," the substance of the bread and wine are transformed and become literally the body and blood of Christ. Their accidents, the appearance, the smell, the taste, the texture, remain those of bread and wine, but the substance is transformed. And the anathemas, curses, at the end of that section are aimed at various Protestant understandings of communion and the way in which Christ is present in the communion. So in many ways, the Council of Trent is reaffirming traditional Catholic doctrine, even though, as the video will point out, the Catholic Church did also reform itself as part of its response. Take a look at the other videos and then look for these key ideas in the selection on the Reformation, which, by the way, is taken from a book I've recently published, An Introduction to World Religions.